setting up the book review sessions and inviting me to speak. The book I'm talking about is A Tap on the Shoulder. You've probably seen the blurb, and it's about Meir Schuster, Rabbi Meir Schuster, who was a shy, quiet man who helped thousands of people bring them back to Torah. Let's start again? No. Day in and day out for more than 3 decades, he stood at the Kotel, or sometimes at the Jerusalem bus station, looking to connect young visitors with their first taste of authentic Judaism. It's a fascinating account of one man's efforts that helped transform many lives. But this book is more than that. It's a tale that captures a very significant era in Jewish history, the Bali Teshuvah movement, returnees to Orthodox Judaism of the mid to latter 20th century. I think it's especially relevant to American Jewry because so many of the people influenced were from the United States. A quick background to set the scene. After Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, there was tremendous euphoria and Jewish pride, even those previously unconnected to Israel. The idea of the valiant underdog that had triumphed against overwhelming odds spurred people to come to Israel. Tourism boomed, and visiting the Kotel was on everybody's bucket list. At the same time, the first cohort of baby boomers were coming of age in a time of economic prosperity, so it wasn't hard for them to take a year or two off to go in their early 20s to backpack around the world in search of new experiences and greater self-understanding. The book begins with Siyata Dishmaya, divine assistance. And we'll quote from Rabbi Schuster's wife, who says, "My husband believed that one must do whatever is humanly possible to merit the divine assistance. But in the end, the result will be determined only by Hashem." He also, he had an intense love of Hashem, which led him to devote himself to helping every single Jew experience that same closeness that he felt. And the young Jews he approached, he saw through him and they saw through him. She said, where others might have seen only the long hair, scraggly beards, and bedraggled clothes of young adults exploring their identity, Rabbi Schuster saw nothing besides Hashem's beloved child, the pure, unsullied Pintele Yid standing beside him. Everything else was extraneous and did not exist. We don't know very much about his early life. He rarely spoke about himself, and he was almost pathologically shy and tongue-tied. He had no ego, which helped him accept the humiliation of the constant rejections he later experienced. Stanley Schuster was born in Wisconsin in 1943 and grew up in Milwaukee. His Polish-born parents were not observant, and his religious grandmother oversaw his religious education, which in those days was mainly after-school Talmud Torah. Just before his bar mitzvah, he transferred to a cheder, which had been founded by the community Rav, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Twersky, that offered a little more learning, including introduction to Gemara. The Twerskys were a major influence on Stanley's life. One of the 5 sons, Yehoshua Shea Twersky, then a 24-year-old medical student, was most involved in his father's cheder. And Stanley, who went to public school, became a regular at the rabbi's Leil Shabbos Tish and a frequent visitor to the Twersky home. Around the age of 14, his friend Jerry Glazer recalled, all Stanley wanted was to learn Torah all the time. By the end of 10th grade, he persuaded his parents to let him attend yeshiva in Chicago. The book goes into some detail about Jewish education in Chicago and the rabbis involved. There's quite a lot of name dropping of rabbis, which people who know them will find interesting. In 1960, Stanley, now Meir Tzvi Schuster, began his studies at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, where he was noted for his exceptional piety, the fervor of his davening, and his great hashmodah. The book author interviewed many of his fellow students for reminiscences. Many of those students went on to become distinguished rabbis. They remember his thoughtfulness and concern for others. He was also a talented artist of kesubas. After 8 years, he left with smicha from Rosh Yeshiva and a teaching certificate from Torah Masorah. After his marriage to Esther in 1966, the couple set off to Israel with just 4 suitcases, planning to stay only a year, and settled in Yerushalayim. He learned in the Mirror Base Medrash and then full-time kollel at Machon Harry Fisher. At some time, he wondered if he was cut out for full-time learning. And the turning point came one day in 1971 when he went to the Kotel with his friend Chaim Kass. There they saw a backpacker close to the wall crying. And this part I must read to you. Sorry. A backpacker, they approached him and initiated a conversation. Chaim was the talkative one. It really affects you, doesn't it, he began, that we got it, the Kotel, back after so many centuries. This was 1971, so it wasn't so long after the recapturing of the old city. Then he made his pitch. Something touched you very deeply here, but one time is not enough. At that point, Reb Meir invited the backpacker for Shabbos, and the young man accepted. For the next 2 or 3 days, the two went back to the Kotel every day, and each day a similar scenario played itself out, where they were able to interest young man who'd obviously had a highly emotional experience at the Kotel in learning about Judaism. Eventually, Chaim couldn't continue, and Meir went himself. Typical backpackers were embarking on a voyage of self-discovery. At that time, the whole Kirov concept was virtually unknown in the US, apart from Chabad. There were 3 yeshivas for Baalei Teshuvah, for men in Jerusalem: the Diaspora Yeshiva, Devar Yerushalayim, and Chapels. There was also Neve Yerushalayim, founded in 1970 for women Baalei Teshuvah, to educate them on the why and how of living an Orthodox Jewish life. In 1972, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, in partnership with Rabbi Mendel Weinbach, Rabbi Nota Schiller, and Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg, founded Shema Yisrael, and Rabbi Schuster became the exclusive recruiter. He also taught a shiur to newcomers on the daily life of a committed Jew, took them to buy tefillin, and taught them how to knot their first tzitzis. Eventually, views diverged on the proper methodology and order of learning for newcomers, as well as visions of the place of Baalei Teshuvah in larger Torah society. In 1974, Shema Yisrael divided into Or Sameach and Eish HaTorah, each with different philosophies. Rabbi Schuster had to decide where to bring potential students. His sole criteria was the best interest of the young men in question. From a practical viewpoint, Eish had the advantage of an old city location. If Rabbi Meir approached anyone in the Kotel who was undecided about following them to hear a class in a yeshiva, he could point out they only had to climb a few steps. It's right above there. The book notes there was something about the Kotel that opened emotional floodgates and stirred feelings of connection to Jewish history. The positive vibes made people more open to what Rabbi Schuster was offering, and he was always scanning the Kotel with a second sense to find customers. Women too were approached, and they were directed to Neve Yerushalayim. Rabbi Schuster would tap someone on the back, ask if they were Jewish, and would be interested in talking to a wise man, hearing a class on Jewish philosophy, or experience a traditional Jewish meal. He was persistent and never took a rebuff as final. His automatic response was to keep bargaining and make counteroffers to get their interest. I found the case histories most interesting. There are many in the book, and I've only highlighted some of them memorable. Rafi Simon graduated Harvard in 1982 and set off to travel the world. In a Bangkok guest house, he was fascinated by a fellow guest meditating. Directed to a Buddhist monastery in eastern Thailand, it was built for monks from Western countries. He met the head monk. Okay. He explained. He explained to the one in charge of the missions he wished to learn to meditate. He was told he could either agree to shave his shoulder-length locks or be limited to a 3-day stay in the monastery. He took the 3-day option. Near the end of the second day, Rafi was informed that the head monk wanted to see him privately. The chief monk asked him where he was from, what he was doing, and where he was going. Rafi responded he was from New York and was traveling around the world with Israel as his ultimate destination. The chief monk told him, "I'm also a Jew from New York who was traveling around the world with Israel as the goal." Rafi mentioned he was interested in trying both a kibbutz and a yeshiva. At the mention of a yeshiva, the head monk perked up and he said that one of the other monks had a magazine with the address and information about a yeshiva. This is in Thailand, in a monastery. The other monk was summoned, and he gave Rafi the famous 1977 Rolling Stones article. I wonder if you remember that. Next year in Jerusalem, by Ellen Willis, about her attempt to rescue her younger brother from Aish HaTorah. At the end of his conversation with the head monk, Rafi asked him how it was that the other monk had the Rolling Stone piece. He's responded, his mother sent it him and wrote that if he had to be a religious fanatic, couldn't he at least be a fanatic in his own religion? Okay, by the time he finished the article, Rafi knew he wanted to spend some time in Aish HaTorah and meet Reb Noah. The realization that he'd learned of Aish HaTorah in a Buddhist monastery in a remote area of Thailand caused him to think to himself, wow, not only there is a God, but what a sense of humor. Okay, he gets to Israel. He doesn't like Aish. He wants to go to a kibbutz. He kept bumping into Rabbi Schuster, who suggested a week in Safat where he would arrange housing. Rafi went to a kibbutz, but ended up in Jerusalem, where he eventually studied Or Sameach. And this is the really nice part of the story. Okay. At one point, he spent time at Or Sameach. At one point, Rafi approached Rav Schuster and told him he was corresponding with a very bright woman he'd met in New York, and she felt that his current path was, as she put it bluntly, nuts. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked Rabbi Schuster. Reb Meir did not hesitate. He told Rafi he would offer her a ticket and housing at Neve Yerushalayim if she would agree to attend at least one class a day for a month. Her response to Rafi, "Let me get this straight. You want me to spend a month at some kind of Jewish nunnery." But come she did. She even stayed after Rafi returned to law school, and they were married before his final semester in law school. Later in the United States, he became an attorney and observant and used his legal talents pro bono on behalf of the Jewish community. Another story is Tom Steinberg, who graduated from Yale in 1978, toured the Far East, and at the Kotel when Rabbi Schuster approached him, asking if he'd be interested in a class on Jewish philosophy. He went to the Pirkei Avos class at Aish every day for a week and was invited by Rabbi Schuster for Shabbos dinner. He took him to his own house, invited him to stay the night, and he took him to shul the next morning. During his second week at Aish, Tom noticed that he no longer craved smoking. He had been a 2-pack-a-day smoker since he was 14. So he felt definitely something was going on. He moved from an Arab hostel to the Aish dorm and discovered that 7 out of the 8 guys there were Yalers. He wanted to stay on at Aish, but his parents persuaded him to go back to the US for business school. He kept returning to study over several summers. Tom, now known as Yaakov, is an investment advisor and has sons and sons-in-law learning and teaching Torah. There's one very unusual story. I'm skipping in the book because I think these case histories are the people that make it all significant. Rabbi Schuster used to check with everybody that they were Jewish, but for some reason he made a mistake with somebody who was actually Brother Adrian, a Catholic seminarian, who'd come to Israel with a dream of becoming a Catholic missionary. On his visit to the Kotel, Rabbi Schuster approached him and asked him whether he would be interested in learning more about Judaism. Because he wasn't wearing clerical garb, Rabbi Schuster assumed he was Jewish. Rabbi Schuster agreed, and he went to Aish Torah, where he remained for a number of months and progressed rapidly in his learning. At some point, he had to go back to America, and then he confessed to Rabbi Weinberg that he was really Christian. Reb Noach was furious at the deception and told him he'd benefited from contributions made specifically so that Jewish men with little religious background would have an opportunity to learn about their heritage. After venting his anger, however, Reb Noach told Adrian the only possible restitution he could make would be if one day he shared the knowledge he'd gained at Aish Torah with a Jew with scant knowledge of his religion. Guess what? Brother Adrian joined the staff of an academically superior Catholic school in Vermont. And there was one student called Daniel who was enrolled there, but they didn't know that he was Jewish. Daniel was only a credit short of graduation, and Brother Adrian proposed to him that in lieu of attending a class, he write a paper on religious figure of his choice. Daniel went to the library of the temple that he and his family attended twice a year and found himself drawn to Rabbi Akiva. When he'd submitted the paper, Brother Adrian looked at him quizzically and asked why he'd chosen to write about Jewish figure. At that point, Daniel did what Brother Adrian had once done. He revealed his religious identity. Brother Adrian was taken back that he'd never known that Daniel was Jewish, but he remembered the promise he'd made years earlier to Rabbi Weinberg and offered to begin learning Jewish texts with Daniel. For the remainder of the school year, that's the Catholic and the Jewish boy, learned with Chumash and Mishnayos together. Daniel, in fact, went on to learn at Or Sameach and became an observant Jew, probably a decade or two after Rabbi Schuster's mistake in taking Brother Adrian to Aish Torah. Okay, another story that I think is really pretty amazing, and if I can show you, I'd like to show a picture. It shows a cowgirl in Idaho. Her name was Holly. She was 17 and brought up as a devout Quaker. She came to Israel on a volunteer program with a dream of becoming a Jew. Rabbi Schuster said she could stay at Heritage House if she pursued the routes to conversion. One of the teachers at Heritage House was Rabbi Asher Wade, who was a former Christian pastor who had taught there and led tours of Yad Vashem. He connected her with Shari Bina's seminary in Sfat. A year later, she converted and she changed her name. She's now Yehudit Abrams, a medical doctor, former biomedical scientist at NASA with years of experience in ultrasound research. She made Aliyah in 2017 and founded Monitor, the first at-home personal use prescription monitor for early detection of breast cancer in high-risk women and survivors. She had an ultra-Orthodox Jew. She now lives in Jerusalem. Okay, there are lots of other stories. If we have time, I can go over them, or you'll read the book. The book follows in detail Rabbi Schuster's life. He hardly had a private life, as he probably spent more time on his mission than being at home, and he never took a vacation. He was always on duty. When he was asked why, he replied, when a house is on fire, you don't decide who's off duty. So he was never off duty any time of day or not. The book details the different ways he connected with people he met, the tap on the shoulder. One of them was offering to send them to yeshiva to hear a discussion or study. His ability to bring a steady stream of potential students to yeshivas helped them survive and flourish. I'm skipping over the chapters describing the challenges he faced in the competitive environment between the different yeshivas. It also surfaced later with the founding of Heritage House. One of the direct ways that he got to people was inviting them for Shabbos meals. There's a chapter called Just One Shabbos, and it describes how he arranged for thousands of young Jews to experience a true Shabbos meal in a warm, frum environment. He could be seen leading 40 or 50 young people to neighborhoods around Jerusalem. And this part I will just read to you. This is somebody, there's an awkward silence as we trudge through the Arab quarter of the old city and continue up towards Gula. The rain has picked up during this time. We're all cold and wet. A few of us in this group of strangers glance at each other as we proceed behind the enigmatic figure leading the way, as if to say, are we nuts? But we're all young and looking for an adventure, and we've found one. As we zig and zag through the back alleys and streets of Meir Sharim, Geula, Malat Daphna, Sanhedria, Mochavet, Reb Meir drops us off one by one at various homes along the way. The rabbi does not say much, if anything, during this magical mystery tour. Okay, taking people to eat was a very important part. He had hundreds of hosts who were eager to share their Shabbos table with complete strangers because they were fellow Jews. One of the most noted one was Michael Kaufman, or Keneal, who lived in the old city, and he was a famed Shabbos host as well as a great supporter of Rabbi Schuster and of Heritage House. The effort put into the presentation of Shabbos, the singing, bringing everyone into the discussion paid off. One young man remembers that at least 8 of those with whom he went to his first Shabbos meal at the Kaufmans became observant. There's a whole chapter on that. Another notable talent was Rabbi Schuster's persuasive powers to get people to stay by offering to change their plane tickets. He actually paid for some secretly so they wouldn't have to leave too soon. Part 3 of the book focuses on Heritage House, which opened in 1984 with separate hostel facilities for men and women, meaning Rabbi Schuster would now be responsible for 2 institutions and fundraising. Heritage House was needed because a large number of Jewish young people stayed in Arab or Christian hostels. Now he could offer free, safe accommodation while providing a place in which young Jews could explore their heritage and a warm and encouraging environment. A fair amount of what I would call politics ensued, and you can read about it in later chapters. The book notes that in the 1980s, Kiruv was finally at the top of the communal agenda. Rabbi Schuster went out to find funders to purchase suitable facilities for the hostel, but he was reportedly too shy to even ask for money. Fortunately, Toronto philanthropist Dov Friedberg understood the need and purchased the building for the women's facility. The book details how Heritage House's environment as a laboratory for Kiruv, although the impact was not easily quantified. This is what they say. Oh, this much is sure. Tens of thousands of young searching Jews crossed the threshold of the two hostels over a 20-year period, and thousands of those ended up taking on lives of full religious observance as a consequence. Perhaps the best testimony to the power of Heritage House comes from those who opposed its message. The popular Harvard-produced guide, Let's Go to Israel, warned against Heritage House in the 1990s on the grounds that those running the hostel would seek to encourage religious observance. Similarly, warnings against Heritage House and Rabbi Schuster were common at kibbutz programs for volunteers in Ulpanim. A new verb entered Hebrew slang, leshasta, to be picked up at the kotel or elsewhere by Rabbi Schuster. On a visit to Muncie after he returned to the United States in 1988, one of the men, Yaakov Sava, found that he recognized close to half the students at Kol Yaakov, the yeshiva, as having been at Heritage House. The true impact of Heritage House is not captured in numbers. It would require the life stories of all that led up to each individual's arrival at Heritage House and all that happened during his or her stay and his or her subsequent history. That's obviously impossible, but some of it's been published. It happened at Heritage House, Tales from the Legendary Jerusalem Youth Hospital. That was done by Dina Estrin, who was a counselor. One thing that her dozens of stories make clear is that the impact of Heritage House cannot possibly be measured from the time of each guest's departure, nor could one know for sure what would have a lasting impact and what not. Okay, that gives you various different stories, which again, they're in the book. Stories were commonplace at Heritage House. Magical places where amazing things happened on a regular basis. Rabbi Meir Schuster's success was dependent from the start on open siyata d'shmaya, and that siyata d'shmaya was particularly manifest at Heritage House. In fact, it attached to the women's hostel long after Rabbi Schuster was incapacitated and capable of overseeing its operations. Okay, so again, there's different details there, which is probably not relevant at this moment. Okay. By 1990s, the traffic of the Kotel had gone down. The second Intifada affected tourism, and you weren't getting the young travelers. Rabbi Schuster turned his attention to Israelis. He went about building something new. He said, we have to do something for the Israelis. He told Rabbi Edelstein. Rabbi Edelstein said, you don't speak Hebrew, I don't speak Hebrew. How are we going to work with Israelis? But Reb Meir was undeterred by what he regarded as no more than a detail. He insisted there was a great need and they must do something. At that point, Rabbi Edelstein did what he always did in such situations. I grabbed onto his coattails and relied on the siyata d'shemaya that was always attached to him to carry us forward. They started a project called Shorashim with Rabbi Abramov, who had been living in Israel, who spoke fluent Hebrew, had wide contacts in the Israeli Kirov world. Yitzhak Meir, the controller of Heritage House, and Rabbi Edelstein. Rabbi Schuster was counted on to continue to bring in funding necessary to sustain the project. Their target audience would be secular, not traditional Israeli Jews, highly educated with little knowledge of Judaism or any great interest, who presumed, without too much Jewish knowledge, that Judaism was irrelevant to their lives. These were the young Israelis who traveled to India or South America following their army service in search of spirituality, which they were confident could not be found within Torah itself. At its peak, Shorashim had 9 centers, including Modi'in and Haifa. In Modi'in's first municipal election in 1998, 2 parties running on platforms of keeping the Haredim out of Modi'in captured over half the seats on the municipal council. At the time, not a single Haredi Jew lived in Modi'in. In Haifa, Shorashim also went into Herzliya, and Rabbi Schuster was busy in those days because he actually had to go fundraising in America. So he had to travel to the United States to meet donors. And if you see in the books names of those in places like Monsey and New York and Passaic, were probably familiar to some of you. In 2007, he was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, which is a pretty nasty disease. His condition was not made public, but a website was started to record some of the stories of the people that he'd impacted during his life. And you can still see the website today. I think there are 50 stories on it. He passed away on the 17th of Adar, 2014. The book's final chapter covers a summary of his impact on Kol Yisrael, but I'll leave it to you to read it for yourself. Thank you.
Are there any questions that anybody had? I know somebody wanted to know what the disease was.
Lewy bodies, it's nasty. It's a sort of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. It's things floating in the brain, Lewy body. I unfortunately have known a couple of people who've had it. And he was incapacitated for many years.
Oh, they weren't able to hear you. Now,
About the Lewy bodies, perhaps you should look it up. It's not a nice disease. If you want, I have more case studies. I don't know if you want another 5 minutes of hearing any more case studies.
Well, does anybody have any questions? I don't know, is there anybody on Zoom with any questions? Yeah, why don't you maybe take,
Well, what eventually became of this sister?
Of
well, she then passed away and
he was ill. The last years of his life, he was ill for about 7 years. So he was actually,
How old was he when he died?
60, 1943 to 2014. What's that? 1943 to 2014, just
like 60.
1943 till when?
2017.
Oh, so he was 43, it's 57.
17, just 70. Yeah, yes. So his full work was from when he was his 30s, 40s, 50s. I don't know if anybody here has ever had anybody who was impacted by him. When I mentioned it to somebody who lives here, she said, "Oh, I remember. I was there standing in Jerusalem with a friend. We were wearing shorts and whatever, and this rabbi came up to us and asked if we'd like to eat somewhere, and off they went. And today she's one of our neighbors with a shaitel and all the good things that went with it." Would you like to hear another couple of you saying another couple of case
Yeah, maybe we
histories?
got 5 minutes. She's gonna give us 2 more.
The case histories, if you have the patience. Sorry, I have them ready. Hold on a minute.
And get 2 more
Yeah.
stories.
Here you are.
How we impacted people.
Yeah, they're all, I think, pretty amazing. Okay, let's get this one. All right.
Let's fix the microphone so we can.
Yeah.
If you can closer to the
All
microphone.
right.
You know what, maybe he would have just sum up what his life accomplished from the time he started till the time passed. You know what, just like summation.
Yes,
Because I know I had a tough time hearing that.
right. Well, I think the significance is
No,
that,
I mean, I'm just saying, the summation of his life, he started out in 1943, he did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 important things in his life, and he accomplished. And you know, just so everybody tries to get some understanding of who he was and what he did.
right.
I mean, you know,
He was-
I don't know, maybe you don't have it put together that way, and you can't do it, you don't have to. I mean, I'm just asking for my benefit, since I came here to try to listen to something, a summation would probably make me feel a little better.
Right. I think it was what it said there. Yes, the fact, the summary is that this was one man who almost single-handedly influenced hundreds, if not thousands, of young people to become
Jewish,
religiously observant. Yes,
believing in Hashem.
right. He was, it was the right time, and he had a passion and a belief in what he did, and nothing was going to stop him. It was at the expense of his private life, of his whole family life.
So he devoted his life to that.
He did, yes. And one of the significant things is that many of the young people were highly educated. They were Yale, as we mentioned, Yale, Harvard graduates, going to medical school. They were looking for something.
Something to hold their hand on.
Yes,
something to
and-
keep their body and mind.
Right. And with the yeshivas that were there and his influence, he was able to get them. So there are a great many people now who can look back and say, Reb Meir did it for me. Yes.
Okay, and thank you very much, Helen. I think it was very interesting and entertaining. And I would point out, some of you had looked at the flyers beforehand. Helen was not scheduled to make the presentation today. She was supposed to do it 2 weeks from now. Unfortunately, Karen Green, who was supposed to start tonight, flew to Israel to be with her mother, and Alan was asked, could you shift and do it tonight? So we thank you for doing everything 2 weeks earlier. And as I said, we hope to see everybody here in 2 weeks when Karen does make the presentation. Thank you.
Okay.